Let's get things started here. Again, thank you everyone for joining. My name is Scott Nadler. I'm with CrossCountry Mortgage, and this is our monthly installment of our webinars that we do. We tackle different topics that impact the real estate agent community, and we try to add value as much as we can. And I am so grateful that we have Frederick Peters here today to have a really engaging conversation about real estate as a business, not just as a sales job. So with that, Frederick, thank you very much again for being here. Before we officially kick this off, for the handful of people who may not know who you are, would you mind just introducing yourself and giving just a brief intro about who you are?
Sure. I joined the industry 46 years ago in 1980. I had a 2-year-old and another on the way, and I felt that it would be a good idea for me to earn some money. I had been in graduate school before then. I started Warburg Realty in 1991. Warburg is my middle name. And the rest is kind of history. I ran the company for, I guess, 30 years. And then in 2021, I sold it to Coldwell Banker. Now the company is part of Compass. And I work at Brand Harris Stevens as a broker. And that, I think, works for everyone.
Fantastic. Now, when did you realize that there was a distinction between being a real estate agent and then creating a real estate business?
I think it took me a few years to figure that out. In the beginning, like most agents, I was just happy to make a sale. That went on for a few years until I became more concerned about the fact that it was such a feast or famine business that I wanted to try and organize the way I worked better in order to feel like there might be more consistency to the flow of my business. Mm-hmm. So I think probably in the later part of the 80s, the 80s were also a very complicated time in the business because the business boomed through 1988 and then it crashed for 2 or 3 years before starting to recover again. So those were years in which I really felt the pinch. And I realized that even though I had started thinking about it as a business, I wasn't doing enough.
Understood. You've worked with so many agents over a 40-plus year career. What are some of the limiting beliefs that you see in agents that keep them stuck?
I'm not sure it's beliefs exactly. I think that a lot of people are just anxious about outreach, and this is, as a million people have said before me, a relationship business. And in a relationship business, the amount of business you do depends a huge amount on how many relationships you build. And one of the things that is interesting about the business in terms of sphere of influence is that ordinarily the people who are in the closest sphere of influence to you, family and close friends, they are not the people who help build your business. They're far more likely to break your heart in one way or another. And it's really the second circle where you build your business most effectively. And you do that by staying in touch. You do that by making sure that you're communicating what you've achieved and where you see the value in the particular things you were able to do. And I think that builds on itself. You know, I used to say to, you and I talked about this yesterday. I used to say often to my agents, sitting by the phone is not a strategy.
Right.
And in fact, if you're going to do this well, you have to be proactive, which means that you need a bit of type A
Right.
in your personality.
Right. And in terms of it seems like most agents know the time-tested activities of meeting people in person, picking up the phone and making those calls are the things, again, in such a long career, those are the things that work. Would that be fair to say?
Those are absolutely the things that work. And I think it becomes more true in some ways. Look, we all do a lot more communicating online than we used to. But there are some things you really should never do. You know, you'd never negotiate by text. For one thing, you want a record. But for another thing, voice to voice, you learn so much from talking to someone else. And I think that, I mean, it's almost like conversations becoming a lost art in some ways. And look, I'm an old guy, so I come from a time period when that was pre-technology, when everything was done voice to voice. And obviously, there are huge efficiencies gained by being able to email and text. But some things are lost too. And I think it's important for younger agents to remember that you don't really create relationships online the way you do by meeting people.
And I think things, communicating with someone over text or email can be interpreted in a completely different way. You could send the same email to two people and they could look at it differently. A great example is, you know, when we're communicating with a client, we'll never text them or email them what the interest rate is if they're asking us, what's your rate? When you have a conversation with them, I want to hear the sigh, the disgust in the rate, or the excitement in the rate. I want to hear that, and let's have some back and forth about that. So I completely...
yeah, and those things don't translate, you know, tone doesn't translate in a written communication unless it's really out there. So you don't know what the person's reaction to what you're telling them is.
Right. And maybe we just answered this question, but if Frederick Peters had to start in the industry today, what would you do? How would you start?
You know, it's an interesting question because I think there are two ways that I would look at that. One is if I had to start today at my age, and one is if I were my 26 or 27-year-old self, which is how old I was. 28, I guess I was when I started.
Let's say for I would say the average real estate agent probably had a career or two careers prior to getting into real estate.
Right.
So let's say somewhere you've had a previous career, now you're getting into real estate regardless of what your age is, and now you're just starting.
Yeah. Okay, I had built, when I was at Warburg, I had built a goal pyramid, and the bottom tranche of the goal pyramid was always about outreach, because that's the way you start. You start with outreach, and at the same time, you really work hard every day in every possible way to learn the inventory. Because one thing that people really are looking for in a broker these days is familiarity with the inventory. And that's a much more complicated job than it used to be because the city has, in many ways, become so much more one large neighborhood than it was when I started. It's like a large neighborhood with regional characteristics. When I started, the people who lived on the Upper East Side only wanted to live on the Upper East Side. You know, the people who lived in the Village only wanted to live in the Village. There was none of the flexibility about location. Also, when I started in the business, with very few exceptions, every sale, I was never much of a rental broker, every sale was a co-op. You know, the condo explosion had not begun. And so those things, one of the things, I mean, just to digress for a second, one of the things I find very interesting with younger agents is how often they will bring a buyer to a co-op I'm representing, and the buyer's really a condo buyer. They just haven't done a deep enough dive into the due diligence with the buyer to figure out that that buyer is never giving you full financial disclosure, for example.
Right.
And that's the other thing, is that you take advantage of every opportunity to learn more about the client. The more you know about the client, and here's the other piece of advice I give people all the time in my negotiating seminars: shut up. Real estate brokers in general talk too much. And if you can actually ask a question and really listen for the answer, again, people will tell you so much more than just the words. Tone, the way they seem to feel about this idea more than that idea. That stuff really guides you, but only if you give them the opportunity to say it.
Right. What's the difference between the lifestyle and the day-to-day activities of a real estate agent who's doing a good amount of volume versus someone who is a real estate agent who's running a business?
Well, that's a really interesting question. I think part of that increasingly today is about whether or not you're running a team. Because if you're running a team, then you literally are running a business.
Right.
You know, they're not 1099 employees, but they are literally, mostly, I guess occasionally they are, but mostly, regardless of who's giving them their W-2, they are, they're working for you.
Right.
And so part of that becomes clear definition of roles. Part of it becomes how you manage, which activities you designate for yourself, which activities you designate for others. I'm not a team guy. I have a colleague, Robert Dornberg, who I work with on almost all of my deals, and he actually worked for me as a manager at Warburg for many years. So he and I really understand each other. And he does a lot of the showing of our listings. But we have pretty clear definition of who's doing what. And I think definition is part of the key to efficiency. And if you're running a business, you have more than one listing at a time. You have more than one customer at a time. And so how your time is apportioned to make sure those people feel taken care of is extremely important. You have to think about it in a whole different way. You have to think about it as a manager and not as an agent.
You mentioned that you're not big on teams. What do you mean by that?
Well, for me personally, I'm kind of a control freak. So I like doing a lot of stuff myself, and I do get harassed periodically by my wife about the fact that I don't have enough help, but I'm a control freak. So, and I have what is perhaps an inappropriate amount of confidence in my own ability. So I feel like if things are going to get complicated, I would rather be in the thick of it, so I know what all the issues are. That being said, I have huge respect for the people who run big teams, because I ran a business, and in many ways, because we always kept Warburg pretty small, in many ways that was like running a 150 person team.
Right.
And it's time consuming and complicated. And, honestly, one of the reasons I came to BHS as an agent is because I was tired of HR.
Yep, I get it. What advice would you give to newer agents who are looking to join a team, what they should look for to grow their business, and would you advise them to join a team? And then what, on the flip side of that, if you are growing your business, what would you advise for more of a senior agent to look for when they're recruiting people to join their team?
Okay, I think if you're a junior agent, I would say there are a couple of things you want to judge. One is the person's skill set as an agent, which you can usually determine by how much business they have. And I also think, this may sound a little silly, but I think it's really important whether or not they're going to be nice to you. And not everybody is. So I would say pay real attention to that, because if that doesn't happen, then I think the chances are that you're not going to last there long. And so the opportunity of learning is somewhat diminished. I would say if you're a senior agent, again, something you and I were talking about yesterday is that our business is a business with an extremely high bar for success and an extremely low barrier for entry.
Right.
So pretty much any idiot can become a real estate agent. And what I would say if you're a senior agent is, first you're looking for two things: smart and hungry. Because unless you're hungry in this business, in this environment, you're not going to make it. It ain't like the TV shows make it seem, in which you make a few phone calls and attend an open house party with a lot of nice hors d'oeuvres and then collect a check for $100,000.
So when you and your wife sit down after a long day, you're not sitting watching these Netflix shows about real estate?
We are definitely not watching Netflix shows about real estate. I am resentful of those shows because they've done a couple of things which I think have been really deleterious to the industry. One, they've made deals look easy. But the other thing is they've made the agent the star. if you're the agent, you're not the star. The client is the star. You're the person whose job is to make the client happy by getting them what they want. And so the idea that it's all about you, it's completely off base.
That is a fascinating perspective. It's really interesting. That's one that I haven't heard anyone say, you're not the star. It's very, very interesting. How do you look at today's market right now? I know I personally speak to agents on a daily basis. I know that there are a lot of challenges out there. Interest rates being one of them.
And inventory.
Inventory. How do you see the market right now? How do you compare it to past markets that you've been involved in? And is there anything specific that you're doing or that you would advise agents to be doing that you think most people are not doing?
I think that when you can't find the inventory that you want, you have to seek it. So that's one thing, is that, you know, and I haven't been that good at that this year because I've been so busy. And Robert is kind of hounding me about it, which is appropriate. You're always doing listing outreach. Because if the product isn't presenting itself to you, then you have to do your best to find it. So that's one thing I would say. The lack of inventory is a big challenge. It's a big challenge. And then you put the lack of inventory together with the fact that buyers in New York are somewhat anxious about the political situation. And as of yesterday, wasn't it, that rates were the highest since they'd been since 2007? I saw that headline somewhere, and I thought, yikes. And look, I'm lucky in that at this point in my career, I'm doing a lot of all-cash transactions. But you know, one of the real challenges people have that I fully understand is they'd rather remodel than move. Mm-hmm. If they're leaving a 2.75% rate behind, you know, borrowing the same amount of money costs like almost 3 times as much, mm-hmm. you know? Mm-hmm. So that's very hard for people.
Right.
And the admittedly artificially depressed rates for such a long time, there's a whole generation of people who grew up thinking that was the norm. Yep. And so to see rates at 6 or 7%, even though to me, that's sort of the norm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I mean, when I first came into the business, the first mortgage I did was at 18%.
Right.
You know, in the stagflation years.
Yep.
I think those are hard adjustments to make. And I'll make one other observation about that, which I find very interesting, which is that we're also dealing with a generation of buyers, you know, Gen Y and Gen Z buyers, who have not come of age during a period in which real estate appreciated significantly, if at all, in value. And so the assumption that was prevalent when I came into the business, that you were bound to make money on your real estate investment, I don't think they see that the same way. Mm-hmm. So they need to have other motivations for making a purchase than simply the confidence that what they pay $1.5 million for this year will be worth $2.2 5 years from now.
Right, right. Yeah, and I always think about there's no cash position for real estate. You're either paying rent or you're owning. You can't you can't put your home needs on the side and wait for the right time. And with rents going as high as they've been, we're talking to a lot of first-time home buyers now, and we're going to see the largest transfer of wealth from one generation to the next, where we see most of our buyers right now who are first-time home buyers receiving gifts from family to purchase homes.
Yes, and I have done several transactions like that this year.
Yeah.
And look, it can be, depending on how it's done, but it can be a very effective wealth transfer strategy. And the other thing that didn't exist when I came into the business, which really exists now, and I talk to people about this quite a lot in the process, is your home is not your stock portfolio. They're not the same. One is a pure investment. One is where you live.
Right.
Where you live matters to your psychological health.
Right.
And so it actually makes a difference what your choices in that arena are in terms of how happy you are. If you have a family, how settled your family can feel.
Right.
I mean, there are a lot of factors that are extra financial here.
Yeah, absolutely. We have a couple minutes left. What's an exit strategy for a real estate agent who is looking to retire at some point?
Start to work with a younger agent. That's really, there's nothing else. And start a good deal of time before the time you're contemplating bailing.
What does that mean?
5 years minimum, I would say.
So 5 years before you want to retire, you should start thinking about minimum. Yep.
Because you want to make sure that you're not only personally compatible, but that the person you've chosen has a style which you feel is going to be compatible with the people that you interact with, your clients, your customers, those people, because that's critically important. Not every two people are a match.
Right.
And you have to make sure that they think and work the same way you do. And then, I think relatively early on, once you've figured out that this is the way you think it's going to work, you then also probably need to figure out what the transfer will look like. Will they pay you referral fees for a few years, yada, yada, yada. And each one of those arrangements is going to be different.
Absolutely. Last question. Summer's winding down. People are going to the beach. They might want a book recommendation. What's a book that's changed your life?
Scott asked me this yesterday. And I said, by and large, I hate business books. I find them boring. And 9 times out of 10, they are an article that appeared in Wired or Fast Company that somebody has told this guy to turn into a book. And really, they should have remained just an article. But one book which I did find, I'm really novel and biography reader. And I feel that that kind of reading gives you a better education about human nature than anything else you can do. And we are in a human nature business. If I had to, I will mention 2 books. The first book, the one business book I ever actually found valuable, was Stephen Covey's The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And And there are certain parts of that book that I still use to try and orient my own business strategy, in particular the dividing of tasks into quadrants, the most important of which is urgent and important, which is what you always tackle first.
Right.
The least important of which is not urgent and not important, which, at least in my life, you never tackle. But the question is how you titrate between the other two. Urgent but not important, and important but not urgent. And most people devote too much time to urgent and not important, and not enough time to important and not urgent,
Very interesting.
which is where your business planning really comes in.
Right. That's the first book, and then you mentioned the second book.
The second book was the floor plan book my wife gave me as a Christmas present 47 years ago, which is what brought me into the real estate business, because I fell in love with floor plans.
It's just called The Floor Plan
No,
Book?
it is called Apartments. It dates itself with this title. It is called Apartments for the Affluent.
Okay.
And it was written by an AIA member named Andrew Alpern. And that book changed my life because it made me realize how fascinating the architectural complexity of the best assembled spaces is.
I love it. So that's it. Thank you so much, Frederick,
This was fun.
for doing this. I had a great time. I learned a lot. I hope you did too. Thank you, everyone, for joining us again, and we will see you next month on the next webinar. Thank you, guys.